Khashoggi, who was one of your constituents. He lived in Northern Virginia. You have said that Saudi Arabia needs to be held accountable for the murder. The State Department has placed visa restrictions on 76 Saudis believed to be involved in threatening dissidents. Treasury sanctioned the personal protective detail of MBS, but nothing for MBS. MBS is getting away scot-free. What do you make of that?
Well, Jake, MBS still needs to be held accountable for this because I think the unclassified report released by the State Department shows he was directly implicated and President Trump knew it. Now, I will say that I appreciate what the administration has done in a short time to scrap arms sales to Saudi Arabia that have bypassed Congress, to scrap the U.S. support for the Saudis' horrible misprosecution of the war in Yemen. And now this action is important, but MBS still needs to be held accountable. We have to figure out how to do it.
So I take your point on the larger reset on the relationship with Saudi Arabia, but when it comes to accountability for the guy that was in charge, who ordered the brutal murder of your constituent, a Washington Post columnist, for the crime of writing a column that said there should be more freedom and democracy in Saudi Arabia, MBS is getting away scot-free. How is that any different from Donald Trump? Joe Biden and Donald Trump have the same position. Save MBS's ass.
Well, Jake, I think you have to look at everything to say the positions are not the same, because President Trump was doing transfers of nuclear technology to the Saudis and not telling Congress, weapon sales, bypassing Congress, sneaking in the U.S. into this war in Yemen without informing Congress, all to butter up the Saudis, and Joe Biden is making a dramatic change in that.
Right, but I'm just talking just on the topic of accountability for MBS, and just for the record, Obama is the one that started with that war in Yemen. But go ahead.
Well, but I'm not sure it was done in the sort of secretive way that Donald Trump pushed it towards, and we had to stop him from doing it. But no, I'm not happy with the lack of accountability for MBS. He ordered it. President Trump knew it, and there needs to be accountability. So as of today, there's not yet accountability for MBS. We're going to have to explore in Congress what more we can do.
In just a few hours, the House is going to vote on President Biden's $1.9 trillion relief package for COVID. A lot of your progressive colleagues are very unhappy with the Senate ruling by the parliamentarian that the $15 federal minimum wage increase will not be included in this bill under these rules, which require only 51 votes. So what should Democrats do now? A standalone bill on a federal minimum wage increase?
I think that's what we need to do, Jake. The budget reconciliation process, as you understand, is very sort of arcane. Most things in the Senate take 60 votes. Right now, under Senate rules to legislate a budget reconciliation bill, you can do it with 50 votes. But each provision of the bill has to be primarily budgetary in nature rather than a policy change. And the Senate parliamentarian has ruled that an increase in the minimum wage that would affect vast swaths of the private economy more than the federal budget is more of a policy change than a budgetary change. But I will say to anybody watching this show, Democrats are unified about raising the minimum wage. And if we can't do it through a reconciliation bill, we'll figure out another way to do it. There may be things in this reconciliation bill that we can do to set the stage. You've reported, and your other reporters have, about penalizing large companies that don't conform to this minimum wage goal that Democrats share. We'll explore those. But if we can't do reconciliation, we're going to do it.
We don't have time, but I just want to note, just for the record, that Democrats might be united on the idea of raising the minimum wage. You're not united on how much to raise it to. Manchin and Sinema, your colleagues, have expressed concern that $15 an hour is too much. But we can talk about that next time you're here. I hope you come back. Senator Tim Kaine of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thanks so much, sir.
You bet.
Any moment, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine could cross one of the final hurdles for authorization, when shots could start going into arms. That's next. In our health lead today, right now, an FDA advisory committee is deciding if it should recommend approval for the single-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine. If given the green light, shots could be in arms as early as next week. CNN's chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, joins us now. Sanjay, assuming the Johnson & Johnson vaccine gets the okay, walk us through the timeline. When could this vaccine be mass distributed?
Yeah, I think it could happen, early next week. We could start to see millions of doses go out. So right now, this FDA advisory committee is meeting. I mean, even within your program, we may hear from them about whether or not they're recommending this to the FDA for authorization. We think they will. After that, there's a committee, a similar sort of committee at the CDC that is sort of the who, when, how sort of committee, meaning who should get this, when should they get it, how is it going to be distributed. And then the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, signs off on that. That could all happen this weekend, Jake, fast. We saw this with Pfizer and Moderna, and we know Johnson & Johnson's been manufacturing vaccine at risk for some time before the authorization. So early next week, possibly millions of doses out.
The J&J vaccine's a single dose. Pfizer and Moderna require 2 shots. How will that impact efforts at mass vaccination?
Well, in the beginning, we're hearing that there's, 3 to 4 million doses that will go out. So it will. I think it'll take some time to feel the impact of this Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But I'd say 2 things. One is that by end of March, and I talked to people on the manufacturing side of J&J just yesterday, they say by the end of March, they do confirm some 20 million doses are likely to be available. That's 20 million people because it's a single shot. And then, as you know, Jake, over the summer, 100 million doses. I think what is interesting as well is that there's a lot of people who, for whatever reason, because they may be homeless, they may have transient, living in transient communities, the idea of them getting a second shot is a little bit more challenging. This may be targeted at some of those communities, so it could be quite helpful.
Some people might look at the efficacy of the J&J, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is 66.1% effective, versus the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are 95% and 94%, respectively. They might say, oh, well, J&J is inferior. It's less. You say that's not the case.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging to compare apples to apples here. I mean, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think the thing that people care about the most with these vaccines is how likely is it to keep me from getting really sick, hospitalized, or dying. And all these vaccines are really good at that. The J&J one, as you know, 85% across the board, and that means tested against the existing variants as well. Even when you include the variants, I want to make this point, when people received the vaccine, nobody died. Nobody was hospitalized at 1 month, and it did a great job of protecting against severe illness. But Jake, I think there's a nuanced point here as well, which maybe is not that critical, and that is essentially that Moderna and Pfizer, their vaccines were trialed earlier in the pandemic. The virus wasn't as widespread. The variants weren't as widespread. So in some ways, it was being trialed against a less severe disease. J&J was trialed against a more severe disease. If you trialed the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines at the exact same time in the exact same places in J&J trials, it may have had similar sort of results. Bottom line, they're all good vaccines.
This new IHME model shows that cases are falling faster than expected. You spoke with the doctor at the head of the modeling team last night. What'd you learn? Why?
Well, I think there's a few things. First of all, these models are, they're only as good as the assumptions you put into them. So, these models have been all over the place. Dr. Murray, as you know, Jake, has said, look, we may not reach herd immunity until the winter of 2022, but it is possible we reach herd immunity this summer. I mean, that's a huge range, obviously. But as far as why the numbers have dropped more precipitously, and you can see them there, we are coming off that surge that we talked about after the holidays and the early part of the year. People are probably being more adherent about masks, Dr. Murray thinks as well. And Jake, we probably do have a fair amount of immunity that exists in the community. We talk about the vaccinations, but people who have been exposed to the virus, the numbers that you see on the side of the screen, you may have 25 to 30% of the country that has antibodies to some extent, so they have some immunity. Once you start factoring all these things together, that can bring the numbers down quickly. It's not that they won't go back up, or they could go back up, but that's probably why it's coming down so fast.
Yeah, they might, as the variants spread, they might go back up, but at least for now, going in the right direction. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, thanks so much. Backlash from President Biden's first ordered military strike, and a great deal of the heat is coming from his own party. Stay with us. In our World Lead today, in the first official announced military action of his presidency, President Biden ordered airstrikes in Syria in response to rocket attacks by Iranian-backed militias on U.S. forces over the past 2 weeks. The site was not specifically tied to those rocket attacks, but Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said he was confident that the buildings hit were used by the same forces. The Iran-backed militia says one of its fighters was killed. While leaders of Congress were briefed before the attack, members of Congress in general were not briefed, leading to bipartisan criticism of Biden today. CNN's Oren Lieberman joins us now. Oren, were these strikes proportional to the rocket attacks on U.S. forces over the past 2 weeks?
That's been what the administration and the Pentagon have been saying, that this wasn't an overblown reaction. It wasn't a major response. It was proportional to the rocket attacks. Those rocket attacks over the course of the past week and a half hit near Erbil, north of Baghdad at Balad Air Force Base, and then in Baghdad itself. There were some injuries as a result of the Erbil rocket attack, including one U.S. service member, and that's what prompted this response. The Pentagon has said that it was in response both to those rocket attacks and to deter future rocket attacks. And Pentagon spokesman John Kirby saying it was de-escalatory, meaning they weren't looking to pick a fight or to start a fight or to continue a fight here. And that is why they're saying this argument was that this was a proportional response.
You got to love Pentagon doublespeak, de-escalatory attack. This use of force is obviously controversial. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, back when she was a civilian, she questioned Trump doing a similar operation. In 2017, she tweeted at the time, "What is the legal authority for strikes? Assad is a brutal dictator, but Syria is a sovereign country," unquote. Psaki said today that there's a big difference in both policy and law between these airstrikes and the ones in 2017. Have Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill seen a big difference?
Well, Psaki's quote there from 2017 certainly mirrors the criticism we're seeing from some prominent progressive Democrats who said these strikes, and primarily their criticism is on 2 points. First, there was no congressional authorization for these strikes. And second, they're worried, particularly people like Congressman Ro Khanna, as well as Congressman Ilhan Omar and Senator Bernie Sanders, that this is perpetuating what they term the forever wars in the Middle East of America. The White House and the Pentagon, Jen Psaki, of course, now has responded saying that Biden is the commander-in-chief and that there was a responsibility and a right to respond to those rocket attacks in self-defense.
Thank you, Oren, appreciate it. We have some breaking news in our politics lead. President Biden speaking in about an hour as he visits storm-battered Texas. Just moments ago, President Biden met with food bank volunteers after last week's deadly winter storm left millions in Texas without power and heat and water. CNN's Arlette Saenz is traveling with President Biden. She joins us live from Houston now. And Arlette, this Texas trip plays into a role Biden is familiar with, being a consoler in a time of crisis and grief.
It certainly does, Jake, and this is a role that many presidents have stepped into in the past, but one that really comes quite naturally to President Biden, as he is well known for his empathy that he relays when he meets with families and victims of tragedy. And we've seen that on display here over the past few hours as he's been on the ground in Houston after that severe winter storm battered the state last week. Just moments ago, we saw the president touring the Houston Food Bank with his wife, First Lady Jill Biden, and you saw him walking up to volunteers, thanking them for his work, even thanking the young children who were there trying to pack together food items for this food bank. And earlier today, he also got that first on-the-ground assessment of what recovery efforts are like in this state. He visited an emergency operations center where local officials shared with him very granular details about the response here, including that 57,000 residents are still having to boil their water, and that they've handed out tons of water bottles to Texans across the state. He was also hearing about the number of school districts that had buildings that found broken water pipes after these storms. Now, the president was accompanied on this trip with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and also Senator John Cornyn. And just in a little bit, we will be seeing Biden here just outside NRG Stadium at a federal mass vaccination site as the president is trying to promote vaccinations in the country.
Yeah, I think the other senator, Ted Cruz, is in Florida at the CPAC convention. Arlette Saenz, thank you so much. And then, speaking of CPAC, Donald Trump is literally the golden boy at CPAC, where it's almost like stepping through the looking glass. We're going to go there on the ground. Stay with us.
Awesome.
And our politics lead, a party for the Trump Party. Today, the conference that takes the temperature on the future of the GOP's activist base featured a golden Trump statue, fiery speeches from Trump lackeys, and repetition of the big lie about the election. Just moments ago,